to give away. We've got one a month. So you should, if you have put your name down, you should hopefully get one this month. You can get a range of products from .NET Trace and ReSharper, and ReSharper, they've just announced a lot of free software as well for the open source community, that sort of thing. So do check them out. Big thank you to our sponsors for this event today as well. Hyperloop Recruitment. If you want to know more about them, you can visit our website. They're linked through, but they're great staffing solutions, recruitment, and it's really nice of them to sponsor this event. And we're on ongoing negotiations as well for the new year. So just a really, really big thank you to Hyperloop. We've done a lot of improvements on the site for the past couple of months, as you probably noticed. A huge thank you to Samson for doing a lot of the work on there as well. If you want to keep up to date with this event, future events, and what the group's trying to achieve, you can actually just log your email on our website now, and you'll get the notifications such as what the schedule's looking like for next year. So if you've got any holidays, you can book around them if you wanted to come to our events. Yeah, I'll cancel them. And that's all from me today. I'm going to pass you on to Mike for the presentation on Xamarin. Just clip this to you.
Cool. I'm Mike Irving, Microsoft MVP. I live over in Macclesfield, and I work for a company called Bluebeck, where we make mobile apps, and we've got teams that make mobile apps with different platforms. So we've got some native apps going on. We've got some React Native apps going on. I'm currently working on a system that includes a MAUI app, and that's kind of been my background for the past 10 years or so as well, trying different app platforms, doing different things, including with Xamarin. This should probably be called Xamarin Looking Back in retrospect, but most of it's about the past, but we'll plough through it. It's my second time here. This was about 18 months ago, and I came to talk about my little spiky friends and various systems and devices that came across with that, and an animation. And if you want to start out in public speaking, I can give you one piece of advice, and it's to remember to bring your computer with you when you're doing a presentation, which I've done tonight, so that's a good start. But yes, Xamarin. This is me. I co-organise .NET North in Manchester, which is a similar sort of setup, and a local meetup in Macclesfield, MacTech. And you can find me on the usual places or read an occasional blog. There's me with short hair. But yeah, we're here to talk about Xamarin, and I think what Xamarin has become confused in recent times. When most people talk about Xamarin, or someone on LinkedIn says, oh, we need someone for a Xamarin role, what they actually mean nowadays is Xamarin Forms, which came quite late in the journey, and it was only one piece of the jigsaw, really. So I'm just going to do a show of hands. So who's heard of Xamarin? Who's used Xamarin? Xamarin Native, so Xamarin iOS or Android. Xamarin Forms. Xamarin Studio, the IDE. Other things around the periphery, Monogame, I'll have a hand here. And yeah, more modern things, .NET MAUI, Uno platform, Avalonia. Yeah, there's a lot going on. Why are we here? Well, you've probably seen some of these notices pop up. Xamarin is end of life. It's already happened. There's going to be no more support, no more updates to it. This was fairly well publicised, at least in the last year or so. It had this end date, and it's been mothballed or killed for a reason. And yeah, you can probably still open and run a project at the moment, but at some point it will begin to fail. So yeah, what was Xamarin? it was actually lots of things. So it was the native apps offering, Xamarin iOS, Xamarin Android. Let's build an app the native way, the Apple way, the Google way, but using C#. Later, you could do similar things for Windows or Mac applications, and something was introduced called portable class libraries to allow you to share some code between your two projects. So you could have an iOS and Android app and a business layer, effectively. There was an IDE, Xamarin Studio, would later be called Visual Studio for Mac. And yeah, much later in the journey came this Xamarin Forms, which is what most people refer to as Xamarin now. And lots of other tools and services popped up along the way. And Xamarin runs on something called Mono Runtime, which is a open source implementation clone, if you like, of the .NET runtime, the .NET framework on Windows. So it's a clone to allow the runtime to run on Linux machines. And it was founded in 2004, probably primarily used to run ASP.NET websites on Apache on Linux web servers. Quite well reused. Sounds ambitious. Let's clone this entire thing. It's not the first time this has been done. So the original ASP, we now call Classic ASP, that had a fake version, Chilisoft ASP, where you could run an ASP website on Linux. So some people think that this is a good use of their time to go and completely clone something. And
Thank you, Miguel.
yes, yeah, the main guy is called Miguel, and this started in 2004, and I'll go over this later, but convergence started with .NET in .NET 5, so that is bringing what Mono offered cross-platform into this new modern cross-platform .NET, and it was considered unified by .NET 6. Where did things begin? I'm going to do a lot of slides with this timeline running down the left-hand side. Don't quote me on any specific dates. They're a little bit woolly, and it's just my opinion of what some of these dates are. But we got this thing called .NET Framework in 2002, .NET 1, and it ran on Windows exclusively, and it was initially used for ASP.NET Web Forms websites and Windows Forms Windows applications. We got another version 2, where there was quite a bit of re-engineering. Took place in 2005, and then there was a version 3.5, and the web platform started to get things like Ajax extensions and .NET MVC and things were added along the journey. And then this version 4.x, has existed for a long time, whatever the first date says there, 2010 till the present day. Still gets updates. I don't know what version we're on, 4.9 point something, but it's very mature. Loads of people run Windows applications on this. ASP.NET web apps run on this. It just continued to exist for a long time. We've had a few more .NETs along the way, just to confuse things. So we've had .NET Compact Framework and .NET Nano Framework. These were mainly to run code on low-powered, embedded, or early mobile devices. So a bit of a distraction here, really, but so we'll do away with those, and we'll stick Mono on the chart. So you can see Mono started very early on, a few years behind the thing itself. That's where it sat. And it became owned by Novell, the networking people, at one point, and it was under their control, and there was some restructuring under place, and some things went on, and in the meantime, smartphones came out, we got the iPhone in 2007, Android 2008, the other one a bit later, and code was being developed to allow you to write stuff to these devices using mono C#. And the original names of the projects were MonoTouch for iOS and MonoDroid for Android. And this structuring went on with Novell, and some venture capital money came up. There's a Wikipedia page on this, but it became Xamarin, and Novell relinquished their control of the runtime, and that's how this happened. Mono still existed as a name, and they converged on this name, Xamarin. So MonoTouch was renamed Xamarin.iOS, and MonoDroid was renamed Xamarin.Android. And these would later be called Xamarin Native in documentation. If we said we're making a Xamarin Native app, then we mean one of these two platforms. And a bit later on, we started to get some other stuff. We got Xamarin Studio, the IDE, that ran on Mac. We got tools for Visual Studio to allow you to do this stuff. And we got this portable class libraries to allow you to share code between iOS and Android. And later we started supporting other platforms, Windows, Mac, and other derivatives. So this was the problem when smartphones first came out. This is an old slide from an old presentation, and maybe you're a web development house and your boss has heard about the iPhone. Oh, we want to make an iPhone app. What do we do? All right, well, we need to buy a Mac, and we need to build it in Xcode, and we need to make it in this strange language called Objective-C at the time. I guess there was no Swift at the time. Okay, so you would probably go and investigate that, buy a book. I did. There's lots to learn, and you'd get started. And then Android phones came out, and the boss would say, oh, let's do an Android version. Is that easy? Well, we need to use another tool. Before Android Studio, it was Eclipse, and you need to do it in Java, and you need to do it the Google way. Oh, well, what about Windows? Oh, well, you need to do that on Windows, in Visual Studio, in C#. So there's no shared code, many languages and dev environments. You probably end up with multiple teams. The free apps you put out probably have got no consistency or feature creeping and things missing on each one. If you came from this room, you might already know C# and the Windows bit might have been easy, but equally, you could have been a company where you were making stuff in Ruby or PHP, and all three of these things could be completely alien. So it was a quite hostile proposition to start making mobile apps. This was Xamarin's approach, again, an old slide. You would still make an iOS UI, an Android UI, and a Windows UI, but you could have a shared C# logic. So this is the portable class library bit. So you could put all your API calls, your mathsy stuff in there, but you can't talk about the user interface, buttons, that type of thing, because they're different on each platform, completely incompatible. But there is a shared C# code base, and the bit that does sit in the middle has 100% native API access, or the individual app builds can have 100% API access. So any Apple API that you want to talk to, or Android API, is available in C# rather than having to write Objective-C or Java. And because it's building a native mobile app, it's quite performant. Again, an old lovely thing. 3 native user interfaces. So you are building an Apple UI, an Android UI, a Windows UI, shared app logic, and target these plethora of exciting devices that were popping up onto the market. And there's a message. This is from an older, a later version of the slide, but this was a snapline. Everything you can do in Objective-C, Swift, Java or Kotlin can be done in C# with Xamarin. Now, if you're a dev or a dev trying to influence a team or the switched on business owner, this is a very compelling argument. We can write something once and it will target these different platforms in a nice language. If you like this sort of thing, the promise there is very good. So let's have a look at these things. So Xamarin iOS was the iOS native platform. You probably can't see that. Here's Xamarin Studio, and we've just fired up a sample project, and it's got this file called main.cs. That is the same as main.swift would be if you did this in Xcode, or whatever it was in Objective-C, and that then calls something else called app-delegate, which again you would have app-delegate.swift in an Xcode world. And you are essentially building an iOS app the Apple way, according to the Apple documentation, but in C#. But that means you need to deal with the interface as well. And the Studio didn't have an interface builder initially. So what you had to do was double click on the XIB, Xcode Interface Builder file, which was later renamed to Storyboard, and it would fire up Xcode. You would do your drag and drop interface building in there, save it, close it, and then it would go back to to Xamarin Studio, and all those objects were then wired up, ready for you to code against. So a little bit clunky, but it was still an exciting place to be. Like, oh, I'm making an iOS app in C#. Later, a proper interface builder was added into Xamarin Studio and into Visual Studio. The Android offering was slightly better. This is mainActivity.cs, which is the same as mainActivity.java, but in C#. So it's structured, all the method names are exactly the same as they would be in Java, but it's in a language that we understand. And the interface is Android XML. So it's an easy to read XML document that describes the UI. There was an interface builder built into this, but you could copy and paste this from Android Studio or Eclipse with no code changes. So you could take an existing Java app and copy your interface in to become your UI. You couldn't do that with Apple because the XIB file, the interface builder file, has got a lot of kind of spaghetti XML in it, and it's just not humanly readable. But that was easier to do, and you can hand code that. I hand code that. It's more like HTML, where you can understand what it means. So yeah, this Xamarin native thing, as it would become known, advantages, well, you can use C# instead of Objective-C and Java. One language, arguably a better language. Not sure if we've got any Objective-C fans, but yeah, it's much better than Objective-C, at least in my mind, and quite similar to Java, I guess. You've got full native reach into the SDK, the APIs from Apple or from Android, and it is fast because it's building a native app. You can do it in Visual Studio or Xamarin Studio. So Visual Studio on Windows, slightly clunky in that you would need a connected Mac to do the build and that sort of thing. The disadvantages, well, it's not really cross-platform, is it? You've got to make two UIs according to the documentation from Android and from Apple. Not write once, run everywhere like we would think of cross-platform today. Relied on Xcode for the interface builder and for doing builds if you were running on Windows. And yeah, you would need the Mac to do the iOS piece. That's not the case today. You can run a MAUI app or a React Native app to an extent straight from Windows onto a device, but at some point you need a Mac to do some of the compilation for you. But back in the day, you needed a Mac instantly. Like, it was a key part of the jigsaw. Xamarin Studio, not much to say really. It's an IDE. You can go in, say I want to make an iOS app, I want a single view, or I want tabs, or some other presentation. There's that file, appdelegate.cs, and because it's running on the Mac, it's got direct access to the Xcode developer tools, including the simulator. So you can debug straight into the iOS simulator, play with your app, press the button, it'll hit your breakpoint, and it'll go back to the Xamarin Studio IDE. It's good. And you can make exciting apps with monkeys and things in. So an advantage is you could develop on a Mac. So if you've already started to learn iOS development, you've probably bought a Mac and started dabbling in Objective-C. And now you've heard about this C# Xamarin thing. I want to carry on the Mac and get the advantages of direct access to the simulator and other tools. And it was quite a lightweight product. It's not like the 20 gigabytes of Visual Studio or whatever it is these days. But on the other hand, it's not a full IDE. It can only really do this mobile app stuff. It won't really work with ASP.NET website debugging or anything like that. You might do some of it. You certainly can't build Windows applications and services on it. And because of that, it's the reason it's small. And it also lacks a lot of the profiling and debugging advanced stuff that Visual Studio kind of leads the way on. Yeah, so then we got this portable class libraries thing. So yes, you've got to make an iOS app and you've got to make an Android app, but you can have a bit in the middle. Business logic. And you would tend to put all your web calls or your data classes, stuff like that in there. And then in the CS files, in the actual UI, you would talk about buttons and text boxes and real things on the screen. Code reuse is a good thing. You could share these libraries with non-Xamarin projects as well. So you could share the library with ASP.NET or a Windows app. There was disadvantages to that though. You needed to avoid platform-specific stuff, so you couldn't talk about an iOS data type or an iOS button or some sort of life cycle thing that only existed on Android, and you had to avoid specific .NET version stuff, so the mono runtime was not the same as .NET 4 point whatever it was at the time that this thing was around. And certain data types were different, so you would find things like, if I do this date creation in mono and I do it on Windows, the result's slightly different. The number format for a double is slightly different, so you had to learn these things the hard way, really. And it's not going to assist you with the UI, it's purely for code. These were replaced with something shortly afterwards called .NET Standard libraries, which kind of exist today with the promise that if you make a .NET Standard library, you've got to adhere to a stricter, older, perhaps, subset of .NET, but with the promise that it will run on .NET Framework on Windows, Mono, and modern .NET. So those things still exist. And then, yeah, later we got Xamarin Forms, which is what we call Xamarin generally now, creating things with C# and XAML markup. So we write some XAML and it spits out a UI. XAML was a familiar concept to Microsoft developers. It's quite easy to read. Some of the UI pieces have got nice names, but they're now Microsoft UI pieces or similar to Microsoft UI pieces. So if you came on the journey at this point, you would learn nothing about the underlying UI pieces from Apple or from Google, you wouldn't know that a button is actually rendered as a UI button on iOS and what the properties of that would be. So it's an abstraction, heavy abstraction. And this appeared in about 2014. Xamarin's own XAML markup, and it wasn't the first XAML. There's been lots of them. So we got WPF XAML in about 2006, completely different to this. We got another one called Silverlight in 2007, which was the markup for the Windows Phone 7, and also Silverlight was a plugin, a bit like Adobe Flash in the browser on Windows and Mac. Then we got another version, WinRT, which was Windows 8 and Windows Phone 8. And then we got another version, UWP, for Windows 10, Windows 10 Mobile and Xbox One. And then we've got a modern version called WinUI. WinUI 3 is if you open Control Panel in Windows 11, that look and feel is WinUI. And they're all described in XAML, but they're all different. So you can't copy and paste the entire document between these things. And that annoyed Windows Phone developers, because if you were developing on Phone 7 in Silverlight, they then changed the platform to WinRT. And there's some funky new things in Windows Phone 8. Can I upgrade my app? Well, no, you can't. Some of your C# might be copy and pastable. Some of your XAML might be copy and pastable, but not the entire thing. And they also changed the platform at that point to Phone 7 was running on Windows CE kernel, and then they changed it to run on Windows NT. So none of the devices were upgradable from 7 to 8. And then they changed it again with Windows 10 Mobile to UWP. Again, changed the dev platform, and most handsets were not upgradable. And those that were, the upgrade process came quite late in the journey when it was already kind of being swept under the carpet, really. But there's a lot to be learned about this, constantly changing the dev platform. But yeah, enough waffle. The concept of the thing, XAML, was probably familiar to people that had done any of these things, even though it was a different XAML. So the difference here was, if you were doing Xamarin native on the left, you could have some shared C# logic to do your webby calls, data-y stuff, but you would have to build free UIs the strict platform vendor way. With Xamarin Forms, you could still take that shared library, but you could have a single UI that would target all three platforms. Yeah, more code sharing. It would still render as native controls. So yes, it's described in this Microsoft controls language that has nothing to do with iOS or Android, but what is actually delivered at the end is a native text box and a native slider and that sort of thing. So in action, there's some XAML, and here's three UIs. So what have we got now? We've got Android, iOS, and Windows Phone. They're all slightly different, so it will, or it would, try and adhere to design standards for each device. So if fonts needed to be a particular size or particular spacing, or buttons had spacing or borders, then it would adhere to that. If you added a tab bar, the original tab bar in iOS was at the bottom, but in Android it was at the top. And on Windows Phone you had these pivot controls. So you would describe a tab bar UI, and at compile time, at runtime, it would spit out the native thing that was kind of a tab bar, even though it wasn't pixel perfect or the same look and feel on each device. It was, they were keen to say that it's going to build native UI. It's not going to be our version of a mobile UI. You could also do it in code. This is quite primitive, but you could write some code to have username, password, and a button. This has become quite popular in mobile development now, and it's much nicer than that code up there. So modern .NET offers a C# markup approach, and the native platforms do this as well. So Apple have Swift UI, and Android has Jetpack Compose to completely design your screens in code. Lots of people prefer that. I prefer that really. I don't really want to be messing around with XML documents with drag and dropping controls that kind of go messy and you don't understand why. But yes, it was possible even back then. So Xamarin Forms had the advantage that for the first time you could consider this a cross-platform tool, including the UI. A bit more like we would expect a cross-platform mobile offering to be today. It was XAML markup. Yeah, there was different XAMLs, but it was familiar. Lots of Microsoft devs will have touched XAML at some point and could understand it. One UI and code base is faster and probably better than trying to maintain different UI definitions in different weird systems on different devices. There was lots of controls and extensions, so people like Syncfusion did controls for Xamarin, so you could have a data grid or a chart, and that was well supported. Telerik, DevExpress, lots of these things. You could put platform overrides in, so yes, you're writing this XAML document, but either in the XAML or in the code, you could say, well, I want the button on Android to be pink, and that's fine. I want the iOS version to have rounded corners, that's fine. It will let you do that. But there's disadvantages, and this top one still applies today to .NET MAUI and to most cross-platform dev tools, really. So you've started to build this app, you've made loads of progress really fast, writing one UI, and you think suddenly, I want to use this third-party component, third-party SDK. Well, if you go to some vendors, like say you want to do push notifications and you go to OneSignal, which is a big push provider, they've got documentation for Xamarin or for MAUI, C#, and for all the other platforms. Fantastic. I'll follow their guide. But I also want to put in Google's ad platform, Google AdMob. So you go to Google AdMob and you click through and you click iOS, Objective-C, Swift. What's in the Android tab? Oh, Kotlin, Java. Probably mention Flutter now. There'll be no mention of C# or .NET or Xamarin. Even now, there'll be no mention of MAUI. And that was generally the experience you got with most third-party components, unless you stayed in kind of the ecosystem of the .NET world with Syncfusion and those sorts of things. If you wanted to go somewhere else, to Twilio or to somebody else, you're on your own if you're doing this. And there was a way of doing this that Microsoft or Xamarin published guides on. You could take the native library, wrap it up in a tool, and it would kind of create C# endpoints to the methods and things so that you could program against it. But it was difficult, and people would put these things in NuGet. So you would go to NuGet and it would have google.admob, and you'd think, oh great. Well, it's not Google that's put it there. It's some guy somewhere in the world has wrapped it up and put it in NuGet. So you would probably download that and start using it, and it would work. But then the person that built that has delivered their app and left the building, and that thing stagnates. And you'd often find that the NuGet version didn't match up with the documentation from the vendor. There was pieces missing. This method doesn't exist. At some point, it would probably stop working because the vendors launched version 2, and this thing is just kind of pointless in NuGet. That problem still exists today. It was also a bit of a second-class experience on Windows as well. So you could create a XAML markup, and the iOS and Android versions were very good, and you would run it on Windows Phone or Windows Desktop, and it was a bit clunky, or a certain control didn't render as you was expecting it to, and yeah, it was almost as if that was only done to kind of appease Microsoft, and it was a second-class experience. And kind of drawing into that, it could be hard to debug anything that went awry on a particular platform. So if on Android the text is suddenly overflowing a button and you don't understand why, well, what are you going to do? You've written your app in XAML. You've got no idea what the native control for a button is or how to fix that. And it was possible. You could have custom renderers for doing things on each of the different platforms, but you would have to do a lot of work to find out what was going on, or it just crashes completely when I go to this screen on iOS. What's going on? Difficult. Debugging experience became difficult. The initial app build was very fast. You'd get loads of screens going and be really pleased with it, and then these problems would start to creep in. So all this was happening around 2014 rather, and a few other things kind of appeared on the ecosystem. We've got Xamarin University and Xamarin Test Cloud. So University, it was a learning platform, a bit like Microsoft Learn. There was lots of text-based tutorials and guides, and there was loads of content on YouTube. And that's still there. That picture was from the other week on YouTube of all these videos that probably don't make any sense or don't build anymore. But yeah, there was a lot of content put on there. And Xamarin Test Cloud was a bank of connected devices on the internet that you could queue your app code to run against, and you could run tests against 30 devices of different types, perhaps. Especially useful on Android because there's lots of derivatives of different devices out there, and someone from Korea might have a Square device or something that you're never going to physically get hold of that device, but you've been told that the app doesn't work properly on it, and you can fire it up on that device and find out what's going on. There's lots of these services around now, and there was at the time, but this one was the one within this ecosystem, and lots of people used it. Also around this sort of time, something else popped up that's worth mentioning called HockeyApp. And this was a third-party thing. It was a DevOps platform. It could do crash reporting and analytics about your app, and it could do builds and app deployments, so you could build it into a CI/CD type pipeline to deploy things. And it didn't explicitly only support Xamarin. You could do native stuff with it, but it was targeted at Xamarin, and Microsoft acquired it because it was part of this ecosystem and renamed it App Center at some point. Just going to talk about pricing. So it was free, wasn't it? Xamarin? Well, no, it wasn't. There was a free version, and you could download Xamarin Studio, open the Hello World app, maybe deploy it to a real device, Android device in your hand, and think, oh, this is fantastic, a C# app that runs. And it had a compile size limit, and it was really small. It was like 64 kilobytes of code, not including any assets. And as soon as you went above that, it said, no, you've got to pay. Most people bought the business version. The business version was what was available originally, and it was $1,000, let's call it, per developer, per platform, per year. So I was working for a company using this, and boss was paying $2,000 for me to use this thing, and this was on top of, you had to pay for Visual Studio at the time. There was no community edition. You were getting an MSDN subscription to have Visual Studio. And then I had a colleague, Ben. He was also paying this £2,000 and Visual Studio. And it was quite inhibitive to growing a team. It wasn't unusual at the time. Lots of developer tools were paid. It seems a bit crazy now. Everything's free, but yeah, it's inhibitive to growth. An indie version was launched. It was $300, or you could pay monthly. It helped out a bit, and that was obviously welcome. It was much cheaper, and there was an enterprise version which was a lot more and had some advanced controls and things like SQL data connectors for Xamarin. But yeah, it was a paid game. So something happened around 2016, and Microsoft showed an interest, and I think you kind of knew that this was going to happen. It was obviously the Microsoft kind of stack for mobile that wasn't Microsoft's mobile, and Microsoft were lurking, and Microsoft acquires Xamarin in 2016. I think you knew in the same way that you knew that Google had been linked to YouTube before the merger actually took place. But the first thing they did was made it free, completely free. Fantastic. Just go to xamarin.com and download it, and away you go. The focus was kind of skewed primarily onto xamarin.forms, the XAML write once. You could still do the other stuff, but that was the buzz, the exciting bit. Xamarin Studio would later become Visual Studio for Mac, or VS Mac, and better support was added for Windows and Mac desktop apps. That was Microsoft getting involved, I guess, but well, let's fix this bit, let's get this bit right. And Samsung added support for Tizen, so you could also write this XAML in C# and deploy to a Samsung TV or Samsung smartwatch, and there was Tizen phones at one point in developing markets. So people were buying into this and adding things to it. And HockeyApp, as I've said, would become Visual Studio App Center. So when this happened, there was a bit of a push on things. Some new things appeared. We got Xamarin Dev Days, which were events across the world to teach people, to tell people about this. And we got an iOS simulator that could appear on Windows, which I'll show you in a moment. And there was also more of a push on getting this content into Xamarin University and telling people about Test Cloud. Some other things appeared as well. We first started to hear about Hot Reload, and there was something called Xamarin Live Player, where you could download the Xamarin Live Player app from the Apple App Store, open it, it would show the camera, and Visual Studio would display a QR code. You could scan the QR code, and your app would magically appear in the app, and you could play with it. And that soon went away. I imagine Apple weren't very happy about that, or there was some technical problem with it. But yeah, lots of excitement, lots of things were happening. So the iOS simulator, so traditionally the simulator runs on a Mac, or it does run on a Mac. It's Mac software, which meant that if you were doing development from Visual Studio, you had to have a Mac next to you to interact with the simulator. This thing was added called Pair to Mac, so you can pair, as long as it's on the same local network, you can see your MacBook, connect to it. It's a bit of a handshake, a bit of software changes hands, and when you come to debug now in Visual Studio on Windows, all your iOS simulators appear, and you pick which one you want. And as long as this tick box is ticked, remote simulator to Windows, then it will appear on Windows. And there it is with the .NET MAUI app, but it's been screencast. So it's still running on the Mac, and it's been screencast to Windows, and any presses you make are then sent back to the Mac. And you can do some funky stuff with it, like you can do multi-touch if you've got a touchscreen Windows PC, which you can't do on a Mac unless you're lucky enough to have a touchscreen monitor. But it is clunky. It'll suddenly stop working, go offline, and you try restarting it and it doesn't restart, and you restart your Windows PC and your Mac and it still doesn't work, and you go back into the settings and you untick that box and you go back to the old way of working where you have to do it on a Mac. So you can still press play in Visual Studio and it pops up on the Mac and you interact there. And there is software to share the keyboard and mouse when you go out the edge of the screen. So your mouse appears on Mac and copies the clipboard and everything. So that's kind of cool, but this is useful, but it's clunky. So what were Xamarin Dev Days? These were events across the globe where Microsoft provided the content and the slides and helped you market this and paid for the lunch and loads of swag. And we did this twice in Manchester. In 2016, there's me with this t-shirt on, and this was at a Barclays venue as well, Rise on Deansgate, and we did it there, and we did it the year after at UK Fast, and we had about 150 people, and Microsoft paid for lunch, and there was a lot of buzz about it, lots of money being pumped in, and people were genuinely excited about this cross-platform. Arguably, it was the leading cross-platform tool at the time. If it was actually out there and people were actually publishing apps from. So what happened? Well, there was a new .NET kind of lurking in the works. So we go back to this timeline, and Microsoft unveiled .NET Core in 2016 and said, we've rewritten .NET. It was a subset of .NET, didn't have a lot of the APIs yet, but you could run ASP.NET and a few things on it. But, it's decoupled from Windows. It also runs on Mac OS and Linux. Oh, fantastic. There was version 2, more features got added, version 3, 3.1, and at that point it was considered quite mature to the point that most of the stack for certainly ASP and Web API, that sort of thing, was there, and lots of people were starting to show interest and jump ship to it at that point. But there was a naming problem going on here, where we'd got to .NET Core 3, and on the left there, .NET 4, that's .NET Framework, that's Windows only, what we'd call legacy .NET now. So a decision was made that, well, we're not going to have a version 4, we're going to go straight to 5, and we're going to rename it to .NET, so we're going to drop the core bit. Core's still knocking about, the ASP.NET still has core on the end of it for some reason, but yeah, it's now .NET.
The confusion with net standard.
Yes.
Is it core or standard?
It's confusing. There's lots of these things. There's been .NET Standard, .NET Native, yeah, things launched that confuse. So yeah, the .NET 5, they started at that point to take some of the mono-y stuff and try and bake it in. So this .NET could run on Linux, on Mac, but there's stuff in mono about iOS, Android, and just lots of other nice stuff that they wanted to bring across to try and make this unified .NET. And with .NET 6, that convergence was considered complete, and it was at that point that something called .NET MAUI was launched, which wasn't very well publicised really what they were doing. You heard about, we're building this other thing called .NET MAUI, and they were sticking to this strict deadline that we're going to deliver this with .NET 6, and they did, but arguably it wasn't ready at the time. When it did launch, you went in GitHub and you've got 20,000 issues, so what's going on? Why have you launched this thing? And well, they launched this thing because they had this this deadline to it. And it has moved on since, but and it's not a direct replacement for Xamarin Forms. It's not directly the same as Xamarin Forms. The syntax is a bit different. Some of the things have been reconsidered and we've built it in a different way, and you do this in a different way, and these properties aren't there anymore. We've got these, so it's kind of the same as XAML app delivery tool in .NET, but it's not the same. So what is it? Well, I'm not going to read this, but it's a multi-platform app UI where you can make mobile apps in C# and .NET and target iOS and Android and Windows and things. So it sounds very familiar. So what do you do? Well, if you've got an old Xamarin app, you're either at the point where you wanted to upgrade or you want to upgrade now, or apps have a life cycle like websites do. You might keep it for 2 or 3 years and then bin it and make a new one. That's a natural sort of thing in software development. So you might decide to look at .NET MAUI for a rebuild, or you might look at a different platform. But if you do want to do an upgrade, then there is documentation about, oh yeah, let's just show, you can make .NET MAUI app, and there it is. It's the same sort of thing. XAML and C# makes a mobile app, and makes stuff for exciting devices. But if you want to upgrade, there's something called the Upgrade Assistant, and you can either run it as a command line tool or a thing in Visual Studio, or you can follow a guide. And it's not, we will take your app, something magic will happen, and here's your new app and it will work. It will do some of the work for you, and then there's going to have to be manual steps because of breaking changes and architecture changes. So if we go to Microsoft Learn, let's say we've got a Xamarin Forms app and there's guides to convert it to a single MAUI project or a MAUI project with a project for each platform like you had in Xamarin. So it's up to you. There's different approaches, and when you get back to Visual Studio after the upgrade has occurred, not everything's been done for you, and you start to see things like this. I can see you've got this. Do you want to change it for this? And that's extremely simple, but it's not always that simple. There's a headache to overcome. In fact, those guides are on aka.ms/Xamarin upgrade. And you can do this with Xamarin Native as well. So you go back to that guide, and there is upgrade guides for Xamarin.Android, Xamarin.iOS to tell you what to do. Same page. These things still exist, but no one really talks about them. So if you go in Visual Studio now and create a new project, there's 2 things there, iOS application and Android application. And that's an Apple style app written in C#, an Android style app written in C#, just like Xamarin iOS, Xamarin Android was. There's appdelegate.cs in modern times. Yeah, if you still want to do that, you still can do that. But it's not talked about, and it's nothing to do with MAUI. That is just .NET platform for iOS. So what about Visual Studio for Mac, Xamarin Studio? This has kind of been killed as well. It was end of life at the end of August, and there was about a year's notice for this, and it was never as good. It was never proper Visual Studio. They called it Visual Studio for Mac, but it was this clunky thing that was just for mobile, and it didn't have all these fancy, rich profiling stuff that Visual Studio has, and it was never going to have. And I think they decided we don't want this anymore. Visual Studio Code has obviously taken off in the meantime. It's very well adopted on all platforms. There's lots of plugins for various things. And yeah, the official line is that you should use VS Code with the C# dev kit, and it will help you make MAUI applications. Another option is you could use JetBrains Rider, which is cross-platform, so you could have the same experience on Windows, Mac or Linux. You could have devs on different platforms, and they recently made it free for personal use, so that is arguably the better option here at the moment. Who knows what might happen. Visual Studio itself will be due a version next at some point, and that could be made cross-platform, maybe. But yeah, this thing was killed. A business decision was probably made, and it's gone. App Center, it's still alive, supposedly, till March 2025. We've got a team at work that had stuff in App Center, not for Xamarin. They were building a native app with it. But something happened last September, not September just gone, the one before. There was a runner in there to build against iOS 17 beta, and then it was never upgraded. And there was loads of complaints on GitHub saying, well, Apple guidelines now say you need to build your app against iOS 17 SDK. You now need to build against 17.1, 17.2, 18 now. And this went unresponded to on GitHub, and there was community stepped in and said, oh, there's a workaround, you can run this script and it under the hood changes the runner to use iOS 18 or 17.4 or whatever. But yeah, this thing had been kind of swept under the carpet as well, and it's still alive, supposedly. You can still go to appcenter.ms, but they've acknowledged now that it is going away, and the official line is that you change to one of these platforms. And I think what's actually happened at Microsoft is the engineers that were working on this have gone that way as well. And you don't have to use these things. You could use Octopus or some other deployment platform to do this for you.
Missing an arrow. Go from Matilda, not sticking to it.
Yes, well, this is the thing. Reading between the lines here, most of the rhetoric now from Microsoft is about GitHub Actions. If you watch videos on Build or anywhere else, they're never using Azure DevOps anymore. Azure DevOps is a great platform, but GitHub Actions, in my view, is the future. So if you've not already made this switch, then I would go straight to GitHub Actions. And yeah, there's no direct replacement either, so you can't pick up your workload from App Center and go there. You need to rebuild your pipelines, your actions, your stuff that goes on. But that's life. Programs have a lifespan, and this one is dead. So you're going through this thought process about your old legacy app, and or try and attempt an upgrade, even though I know that the app's quite old or a bit clunky, or do I rebuild it? And if I do rebuild it, well, do I want to rebuild it in MAUI? Because I've heard things about it not being very compatible or being clunky, or what else is out there? Well, there's some C# alternatives. So Uno platform, it's C# and XAML. Well, that sounds familiar. It's not the same XAML. It's based on WinUI 3 now, so it's like the XAML that describes the modern apps on Windows 11. It's got a C# markup option, UI as code, which works really well. It's based on WinUI. It renders native controls like MAUI does, so it builds an actual Apple button and an actual Apple text box. They're not drawings. And it works on mobile, desktop, including Linux, which MAUI doesn't support, and it supports the browser. You can run your app in WebAssembly, so you can run a WinUI style application in the browser. It doesn't have to have the WinUI look to it, so it's got themes for Google Material and an Apple theme that they call Cupertino, so you can give it that look and feel in the browser. It's very mature and quite solid. It's got a Figma plugin, so if you work in a company that uses Figma, your designer can design an Uno platform app. It will have all the controls there. They can build it, and they can actually run it in Figma in Uno platform. It actually fires up the WebAssembly Uno inside Figma. You can interact with it, you can play with it, you can do the button click to go to another screen, and you can then click the code tab and get the XAML or C# markup and paste it back into Visual Studio, and it will work. That's quite a compelling argument. Figma has already taken off as, in my eyes, the leading sort of design tool, and being able to do this with it is fantastic. There's no dependency on .NET MAUI or Xamarin. This is a bit of a misconception I've heard a lot. People say, oh, no, we can't use the Uno platform because it's yet another abstraction away from the core layer. It's Xamarin with extra stuff on it. That's not true. It sits straight on top of .NET, just in the same way as MAUI does. And because of that, you can do MAUI embedding, which means if you've got a particular screen in MAUI or a control, a Sync Fusion chart maybe, that you want to bring over to Uno platform, there's a way of embedding that with some XML inside XML sort of funkiness, with the caveat that that'll only work on platforms that MAUI supports. So it won't work on Linux and it won't work in the browser. So yeah, you can build apps for iOS, Android, Windows, Mac, Linux, the browser, and embedded devices in Uno platform. But there's another one. You had Mike James here a while ago talking about Avalonia, and well, what's this? Oh, it's C# and XAML. Oh, sounds familiar. Again, it's not the same XAML. It's their own. It's Avalonia XAML, loosely based on WPF. There's a C# markup option. The difference here is the interface gets drawn using Google's Skier library. So it all gets pixel drawn. It's pixel perfect everywhere. So it looks the same everywhere, but that could be a disadvantage because, well, if you're using a screen reader or something like that, then the screen reader probably prefers proper controls so it can read the document of flow on. So swings and roundabouts really, but it is fast. It's mobile, desktop, including Linux, again, which MAUI doesn't support, and browser, which MAUI doesn't support. It's probably fair to say it's more mature for desktop. This came from a desktop offering. It's very old, this. It's older than MAUI, it's older than lots of these things. But yeah, it's quite mature now for across the board. What they have launched in the past year is something quite interesting called XPF, that if you've got a WPF application in your organization, excuse me, the promise is bring your WPF app, run it on XPF with 0 lines of code changed, and there's your WPF app on Mac and on Linux. And I've seen this running on iOS and Android as well. So it's a bit weird, a WPF app as it looked WPF running on an iPhone, but it's possible. And yeah, they want to talk to people about that. And again, it's got a MAUI embedding option. And again, it's got no dependency on Xamarin or MAUI. It sits straight on top of .NET 8, or as of tonight, .NET 9. And yeah, exciting. An app on a phone and some other app. So what about native? So we go right back in the story to, we didn't want to write Objective-C because it was weird, and we didn't really want to write Java either. Well, in the meantime, two other things have come along. Apple launched Swift, and Google went with Kotlin, which is a JetBrains language, and modern programming languages, and they've both got a markup as code option, Swift UI from Apple and Jetpack Compose from Kotlin. And there's two sort of crappy code snippets here from an old blog I wrote, but the point is that they're quite syntactically similar to the point where you can grab a block of code, paste it from one to the other, change things like let to val, and change any UI references about buttons, perhaps, from one to the other, and then it works. And it's nice syntax. You couldn't do that between Objective-C and Java. They were so different. Methods in Objective-C were strange, and you couldn't have this luxury.
Is that typo on the Kotlin side, or are functions called fun?
Yes, they're called fun. So yeah, you copy that from that, and you take a C off func to call it fun, and then it works. So yeah, I've done a lot of. I've come from this journey of Objective-C and Java, did Xamarin, and then went back and did some native apps. And the new languages are nicer, but there's also advantages in if you fire up the Hello World app in MAUI with the little guy in a racing car, it's about 20 megabytes, and it takes 5 or 10 seconds to come on screen when you click the app icon. 20 megabytes. If you fire up the sample app in Swift, add a few things to it if you want, deploy it, it's on instantly, and it's about 150 kilobytes. So that's the trade-off. It's much smaller, it's much faster, it's native, but it's not C#, and it's not got this advantages of the .NET runtime and all this stuff that you might champion for, but it's fast. It's a proper platform. All the documentation's there from the vendors specifically for these platforms. There's other cross-platform tools, and I've mentioned Flutter before. This is Google's offering for cross-platform, and it draws the UI like Avalonia does using Skier. So it's pixel perfect, mobile, desktop, browser. You will need to learn and use programming language though, because the programming language is Dart. If you've been around the houses like I have and tried all these different things, then I'm not that fazed about that. Most of these languages now are kind of C-based, and you'll pick it up, but yeah, you will have that pain to go through. Another is React Native. So this is from React, which is arguably the leading web front-end framework now, from Facebook, and React Native describes pages and controls in a similar way, and the code can be written in TypeScript or in JavaScript. And between the two of those, they've probably got 90% of the cross-platform market now, to the extent that they don't suffer so much from this third-party SDK integration issue. If you go to a vendor, it's highly likely now that they'll mention React or Flutter. You still won't mention MAUI, because MAUI's a tiny player now. So from that buzz year, 2016, when Xamarin was really exciting, have we missed a boat? I don't know. And where did the enthusiasm go? Well, if you keep your eyes closed for so long, then other players come on the scene, don't they? So Kotlin have a multi-platform mobile offering. The approach here is you carry on creating your app as if it was an Android app. You can use Jetpack Compose markup, and it will fire out an iOS version. And it's a little bit like the early days of Xamarin, where it will fire up Xcode and you have to do something to enable something, and then eventually it works, and then you get your iOS app. So it's a little bit clunky and experimental, but if you've got a Kotlin team working on something, then it could be a serious contender. It's tiny compared to the other two. It's tiny compared to MAUI, I should imagine, but there's a few of these things about. Yeah, and that's kind of it. The Xamarin is end of life as of this year. Most things have been turned off now. You could probably still open a project, it'll probably still run, but it's beginning to get to the point where it will fail. There'll be breaking changes in iOS, Android, other things, and it will stop at some point. You will either need to upgrade or have serious issues to deal with. Although there was a development the other week, and Mono has been donated to Wine. I saw this on Twitter from Scott Hanselman. What's Wine? Wine is not an emulator, it stands for, and Wine is a framework that sits on top of Linux desktop, APIs which can interpret the APIs in Windows applications and map them to things in Linux. So you can run Excel in Linux desktop. And certain handheld portable PC gaming devices actually run on Linux with Wine and don't actually run Windows. And Microsoft have done work supposedly with these manufacturers to get DirectX and things to work nicely on Wine. And Wine itself is older than .NET. It's a very old thing, and it seems like a good place for Mono to go and to live alongside. Microsoft we've had it, we've stripped what we want from it, we've made this new .NET, and we don't need it anymore. Let's move it on to somebody else to look after. And that's kind of it. That's me. And my slides are on GitHub, and that's a QR code that takes you to a README file, which includes all the links which I have mentioned tonight to various platforms and tools. You can reach out to me, and I'm open to any questions.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Mike. So, big thank you to Mike for coming out this afternoon, traveling from Manchester. We know the trains aren't great at the moment, so, and you know, really thank you, Mike. It was good to have that brief history into .NET and the offerings that they had in that mobile world. I'm hoping they're going to pull something out of the bag to try and bring that back and overtake React Native and that sort of thing, but we'll see what Microsoft's got next. I think there's a massive investment into AI at the moment, which is taking up a lot of their budget.